Hey, everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the Engineer's going to be there. Meat Eater Live, headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay, every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Arts Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.
You're listening to the Sportsman's Nation Podcast Network, brought to you by Lacrosse Boots. Now, Lacrosse is at it again with a new line of lace-up hunting boots, the Navigator Series. And in that Navigator Series, there are two models. There's the Atlas for men and the Windrose for both men and women. To find out more information about this new Navigator Series, visit lacrossefootwear.com.
My name is Clay Newcomb, and I'm the host of the Bear Hunting Magazine podcast. I'll also be your host into the world of hunting the icon of North American wilderness, the bear. We'll talk about tactics, gear, conservation, but we'll also bring you into some of the wildest country on the planet, chasing bear.
Something that's been in the ground for thousands of years. How did it get there? Was it dropped? Was it shot at something?
Right.
And it's buried, and you come along and pick it up, and all you can do is wonder. How these people live.
Everyone I've picked up, and you probably, I guess this is what a lot of people think, but you wonder, how was it lost? Was it shot at a deer? Was it shot at a bear? Was it just discarded because it was not usable anymore? Was it lost?
Right.
Did someone give it to his son, and his irresponsible son lost it?
I'm sure that never happened.
That boy right there's lost a lot of stuff of mine. If you are a hunter, there's probably deep inside of you somewhere some real curiosity and a desire to know more about Native Americans and how they used this land and how they hunted. On this podcast, we are going to jumpstart you by 15 years in your knowledge of Native American stone projectile points, number one. Number two, who came here first in North America, where they came from, and all the different ideas of where these people came from, and an understanding of the different time periods in which humans have been here in North America. And the reason I say 15-year jumpstart is because for 15 years I've been highly interested in Native American stone projectile points as we began to find points on our property in different places. And I've just gathered information from different sources, different places. I never really could find like a Dummies guide to stone projectile points in Native American history in North America. And so I wanted to sit down with an expert, and that's just what we're going to do on this podcast when we sit down with Dr. Adam Gray. And he talks about, we just have a fascinating conversation for about an hour and 15 minutes that really, if you listen to this, you will have a ton of valuable information that's going to project you into more study, or if you just learn some of this stuff, you're just going to be fascinated. So, incredible conversation. You're going to enjoy this podcast. I want to draw your attention as well as we come into the fall season here, and we're baiting bears in different parts of the country, to our friends at Northwoods Bear Products. They have a full line of bear scent attractants, and Northwoods is known far and wide for their Gold Rush, which is a fryer grease additive, which is one of my favorite products that they have for drawing in bears. But they've also got just spray bottles full of scent, all types of different flavors. They've got some dry powder scents. But check out our friends at Northwoods Bear Products this fall. And we're pounding away right now on the September-October issue of Bear Hunting Magazine. This issue will be in the hands of our subscribers before September 1st, and it's a very good issue. A lot of good how-to stuff, a lot of great content. We've got an article about Ed Vance, who was on the last podcast. We've got some scouting tips for fall bear hunting. We've got 5 creative ways to kill a bear in 2019 in the fall. We've got the story about my 550-pound Oklahoma black bear from last year. So if you're not a subscriber to Bear Hunting Magazine, check it out at bear-hunting.com, bear-hunting.com. We are in Melbourne, Arkansas. This is my first time to Melbourne, Arkansas.
Well, welcome.
Yeah. We're in Melbourne, Arkansas, and I am in the home of Dr. Adam Gray. You're a medical doctor, Adam.
That's correct. That's correct.
I've just been calling you Adam.
Yeah, that's okay. That's all right. Please call me Adam.
So where you work out of Melbourne?
I do.
Is there a hospital in Melbourne?
There is not a hospital here, but I have a family practice clinic here where I lease space from Baxter Regional Medical Center in Mountain Home, and I have a family practice clinic there with 2 nurse practitioners. I also work in an emergency room in Salem, Arkansas, and I also attend to patients in 5 nursing homes around here. A little jack of trades, master of none.
Why I'm here is you were referred to me by a guy that I kind of follow that's big into digging arrowheads for the layman's terms.
Right.
But stone projectile points, Native American artifacts, that's what you've devoted, as I understand, the last 15 years. You've become a collector. You find arrowheads. You're a regional expert, I would say.
Thank you. I try to be.
You know a lot more than me, let me put it that way.
Well, it's something that I've devoted a lot of time to, and physicians are weird people. They don't get into anything just a little bit.
Right.
They're all or none,
Yeah.
But since I found my very first arrowhead with my son's mother about 15 years ago, it's become a hobby, and a lot of people would say an addiction. There are people that do this a lot, and it takes up a large percentage of their time, but it's a lot of fun. Yeah. And it's great fun for me and for my family, and I read a lot of archaeology journals and learn about what we're finding. And you can go back and learn about how these people were living, back thousands and thousands of years ago.
Well, I'll start by telling you a little bit of why I'm so interested in this. And I've already shared it with you a little bit, but several years ago, we got mules. We own 7 acres in Washington County, Arkansas. There's a creek that borders the front side of our property and a small tributary creek that borders the western side. We started getting these mules, and the mules made trails. They had spots where they were rubbing, where they were dusting, where they ate the grass down, and where runoff started to create, bare spots out in this field, which is bad for pasture health and soil health. But we started bumping into these stone points in our front yard. And I'll tell you what I tell the kids every time we pick one up is, and it's so unique when it happens on your own place, and we're gonna get into a lot more than just that, but when I picked up that arrowhead, that first one, I told the kids, I said, the last human that touched this before me was planning to cook his meal over an open fire with a critter that he killed with this stone.
Yes, and I have said that exact thing to my kids on numerous occasions.
Yeah.
Something that's been in the ground for thousands of years. How did it get there? Was it dropped? Was it shot at something?
Right.
And it's buried, and you come along and pick it up, and all you can do is wonder, how these people live.
Everyone I've picked up, and I guess this is what a lot of people think, but you wonder, how was it lost? Was it shot at a deer? Was it shot at a bear? Was it just discarded because it was not usable anymore? Was it lost?
Right.
Did someone give it to his son, and his irresponsible son lost it?
I'm sure that never happened.
That boy right there's lost a lot of stuff of mine. That's the mystery of it. I think that's the intrigue of finding this ancient stuff with people that were really just like us. I mean, they were humans. They had dreams, and they cared about their families, and they wanted their sons and daughters to prosper, and they had needs that had to be met. I mean, they were humans, but they lived in this lifestyle that is so different than us.
Right. They were camping 365. I mean, and following the food, food and water and shelter. Those are the three things they had to have.
Yeah.
And so they developed over time these technologies that would allow them to procure what they needed in order to reproduce, to survive, and eventually to thrive and become, the Mississippian period Native Americans that we all think of when we hear the word Indian.
Right. Well, okay, this conversation is going to be difficult because you know so much, and I have so many questions. And we're sitting here in your office, your library, and you have this amazing collection of stone points from all over. Well, most of them would be from the South, I guess, but some of them would be from other places.
Sure. I collect points from mainly from what we call the central states, which would be from Nebraska to West Virginia and Michigan down to Louisiana, that area.
Okay.
Yeah, all the points in this area are somewhat related to each other through time and in different space. We call it spatially. They overlapped areas.
Yeah.
And as these point types evolved over 13,500 years, you can see similarities between different types of points, and you can see the evolution process, and that gives you clues into what the climate was like and what they were hunting. And what they were using these points for, because not all of these points were shot at things. Some of them would have been knives. Some of them may have been a true spear point. Some may have been a true arrow point. Some may have been a tip to an atlatl dart. So,
well, there's several things I want to talk about. The first thing, and we're approaching this from the standpoint of like we're talking to people that don't know anything about these people. And so my first question, or what I want to talk about first, is where did these people come from?
Boy, that's the $64 question right there. And there has been a theory that's been around for a long time, and it's called the Clovis first theory. And that's the null void point right now that we're trying to figure out, is that the case or not. But that theory it says basically that it's believed that the first Americans came across a Siberian land bridge over into Alaska through an ice-free corridor through Alaska and Canada and populated North America and then spread out into Central and South America from there.
Right.
That theory's
that's been widely accepted for a long time.
A long time.
Right.
But there are some problems with that theory, and one of those theories is that one of the problems with that theory is that when they radiocarbon date, you can't radiocarbon date a point, but you can radiocarbon date something that's sitting next to it, like a burnt acorn shell or hickory shell. That's something that's got carbon in it. When they get these associated dates for Clovis points, they date older in the southeastern United States than they do anywhere near Alaska or the northwestern United States. And so that doesn't make sense. It doesn't support
I want
the
to
theory.
even stop you right there. So the Bering Land Bridge would have been an ice-free zone because of glaciers and a much colder climate, so the oceans were lower.
They were much lower.
Because much of the Earth's water was capped into these glaciers.
Right.
And so basically from Alaska to the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia would have been this 1,000-mile wide land bridge.
Yes.
I recently heard a podcast from a guy, Steve Ranella, so some of this is just fresh on my mind, but they talked about how, and certainly people did cross that land bridge.
They did.
So we're not debating whether they crossed it.
Right.
What you're going to talk about in a minute is the theory of were they the first,
right?
Because that's been the main thing is were they the first people, and so that theory would have been that people crossed over from Asia, and they came in and from Alaska basically populated North and South America. The Clovis site is in New Mexico, and so what you're saying is that the oldest site that we know of from radiocarbon dating, finding these points, finding this mammoth skeleton, would have been older than anything north of it.
Right.
So if they would have been the first, there should have been older sites up there.
Correct. And that's not what they're finding. And so that doesn't support that theory. And so there are some other theories that are being put forth right now, and some have a lot of supporters and some have a few. One of those theories is that, okay, let's go back and talk about the Clovis point for just a minute. Clovis points are what we call fluted. The base of the point has been thinned with something called direct percussion, where they hit the rock directly and knock flakes off of it and thinned it. That technology does not exist anywhere else on planet Earth. It is only in North America, and it's widely regarded as being the first invention in the New World. Because it's not found anywhere else. But it's unlikely that someone stepped across the Bering Land Bridge and knocked out a Clovis point and went from there. They were using some kind of tools before that technology was developed. So a lot of people now believe that the Clovis technology started somewhere in the southeastern United States, and the technology spread much more rapidly than the people spread, but it spread probably northward and westward into a population that already existed.
Okay.
And so if you believe that, then you still have to ask the question, what kind of tools were they using before that, and where did they come from?
Okay, so if what you just said is what happened, then does that explain to me how that could nullify that they weren't the first people? The first people didn't come from the Bering Land Bridge.
Right. First of all, we do have a lot of information that we know that Native American populations in the United States and in Central America share certain genetic haplotypes with people from Siberia. So we do know that the DNA came from Siberia, at least some of it. Okay. You know, there's no way to prove all of it didn't. But so we do know they came from there. But the other
all of them did.
That's a good question. We really don't know. There's some theories that say that there may be some European DNA in groups up in the northeastern United States that share a lot of their language patterns with Norwegian languages, and that there were blue-eyed Native Americans up in that part of the country also. And so
people that would have crossed over.
Maybe a similar type of passage, maybe from Norway through Greenland and Iceland, that area, maybe skimming along the
when the oceans were lower,
right,
and there was a land bridge.
Could be right.
Okay,
so that's another theory, and there's also a theory that the Clovis technology came from a previous technology that existed in France called the Solutrean technology. There are a lot of similarities between the two technologies. Solutreans didn't flute their points, but other than that, the technologies and the toolkits that they used were very similar. So could
it not be possible that two people would come up with the same thing though independently, or is that highly unlikely?
It's highly unlikely, because if it were to happen, it wouldn't happen in the same continent. It would have happened around the world, like so many other different technologies have evolved.
Okay, I see so you're saying because it happened one place here, and something very similar happened one place here,
right?
That they're connected. If it had happened 10 places,
right,
maybe this just like
it would make more sense.
This is just the way that kind of, if you have a rock and you want to kill something, you start knocking around on it, you get that point.
Right.
Okay.
Convergent evolution, I think the biologists would call that.
Oh, okay.
Rather than divergent evolution, but there are many technologies around the world that have evolved separate from one another, but ended up being the same thing.
Okay.
Okay. But I don't think the fluted point technology is one of those at all. So we're looking at a fluted point type that was invented in North America and found nowhere else in the world.
The first American invention.
Right. Very first. Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting way to look at that. There are also some theories that maybe some Polynesians or other groups populated the Western Hemisphere from South America, the very southern part of South America, where there are some very old sites down there that date much older than anything in North America. There's another point type in South and Central America called the El Hobo Point, and there are some people who are theorizing now that point type traveled north from there and then became a fluted point called a Cumberland Point, and that Cumberland points evolved into Clovis points. Now that's a sticky subject with a lot of people because everybody's got their opinion on this, but the problem with it is Cumberland points haven't been well dated anywhere yet.
Well, so are you saying the oldest sites that we know between North and South America are in South America?
Yes.
Okay, so for that, when did that knowledge come forth?
It's been in the last 15 or 20 years.
So relatively new.
Right.
I mean, I guess for...
And I've talked to several vocational archaeologists about that, and some of them just blow it off and say, no, there's problems with the data, the dates aren't good, things like this. But there's a whole nother camp, and that's how science works. You have to put forth something, and then you discuss it, and they come to a consensus about it. But
20 years later, they decide if it was right or if it was wrong.
Right.
So, but inside, I mean, it is plausible, I guess, that inside of the Bering Land Bridge theory, what would you call that? Just so I'm using the right.
Clovis first, and that kind of encompasses the Bering Land Bridge.
Okay, so with the Clovis first theology, it would just be happenstance that just the oldest site we found was in South America.
Right.
Like, so there's older ones, we just hadn't found them.
Right.
This just happens to be the one we found way down there.
And there are some sites in North America that have been radiocarbon dated, human occupation, older than any known Clovis dates that we have in North America. The Topper site, the Metacroft rock shelter site, some sites that we know there were people living there. We just haven't found any tools yet or anything that's diagnostic that can tell us these people were these people. So they've got some very crude stone tools. I think that's eventually going to happen. I think those sites are extremely rare, and we just haven't found the right one yet.
You know, when you think about the amount of land space in the amount of that space that has actually been excavated by people that knew what they were doing.
Right.
I mean, I'm just a novice just thinking.
Right.
But I mean, it's like there could be something 2 feet under the foundation of your house that could unlock the whole story that we'll never know.
You'd never know it's there.
I mean, so I guess you just have to work with what you do know.
Right. And I would call myself an avocational archaeologist, an amateur archaeologist. I don't do this for a living. I do it for fun. I don't excavate in a controlled fashion like archaeologists do, but archaeologists are limited in what they can do. First of all, they're relying on public monies most of the time, which is limited, and it's just not a priority in our culture, unfortunately. But they're also limited by time. They have to stand back and brush dirt off of things and find them and record them. And we're people who like to go out and find arrowheads, they do it when they want to, when the weather's good, and they do a lot of it. And so most of the knowledge that we have about point types actually come from people who don't do this for a living.
I see.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So the best thing that can happen is for archaeologists and people who hunt these points to come together and find a way to work together to identify a site. And I'll give you a good example. Dr. Julie Morrow over at ASU is a friend of mine, and she has spent a significant portion of her career looking for a Clovis site in Arkansas that is stratified and can be dated and studied, and it just hasn't happened yet. And she's not going to be
by Clovis site, that means the technology of that fluted point with the thin bottom.
Right. And she's not likely to find that unless somebody comes forward somewhere and says, hey,
they found one.
We're finding this stuff here. You need to come excavate this. And so, we've got to figure out a way to work together.
Yeah. That's interesting. So, okay, so we've established that now, would you say the Clovis first is still the predominant theory?
Yeah.
But there's just some other things that kind of
don't make sense.
Don't totally make sense.
Right. And so right now we're still going with that theory, Clovis first. That's the oldest point type that we know of.
And so that was 13,500 years ago.
Yes, roughly, yes.
So, but that's in New Mexico.
Right.
So the first people that came over the Bering Land Bridge would have been how long ago?
Oh, that's a good question. There are some sites in North America now that date up to 14, 15,000 years ago.
Okay.
And they probably...
And that's the buzzword number that I have heard. 15,000 years.
It
so
seems to be.
there's been human occupation in North America for 15,000 years.
And they probably didn't get a group of 10,000 people and march them across the Bering Land Bridge. They probably came in waves.
Yeah.
10 or 20 or 30 here, and so there was kind of constant infusion of these people coming across here seasonally. When the weather permitted. They were probably following food, which is what most that's what they were doing. They were following whatever they could eat.
Yeah.
And so eventually they just found their way over here, and then got a little further south. And
now, you said something earlier about the genetics. So talk to me a little bit about that. Like, so they've taken, because there's still intact tribes of Native Americans that are alive today.
Yes.
And so they're able to do genetic testing on these people, compare those and I know nothing of this other than just the idea of it, with people over from where?
From Siberia primarily. They've done some testing on DNA haplotypes from Siberia and Japan and even Polynesian countries, and compared that to DNA that has been voluntarily given by Native Americans. Now, an interesting caveat to that is that a lot of the North American Native Americans that we're familiar with, those tribes, they refuse to give any blood for sampling. And they have their reasons for that, and you have to just respect that. So most of the haplotyping that's been done has been done on Central American Native Americans.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so they're having to compare to those, but it's assumed that they're related, and most likely they are, So that's just an interesting little caveat.
So without a doubt, these people can be connected back to over there.
No doubt. No doubt at all. And Dr. Morrow has been involved with a little bit of that. I believe it's the Anzac site out in the northwestern United States where an infant was found buried with Clovis tools, Clovis bifaces, large what they call platter bifaces, and Clovis points. And DNA was recovered from that skeleton and compared. Really? And so that skeleton has been shown to be related to Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere.
Now, okay, if the Clovis first idea wasn't true, wouldn't there be people in South America that were connected to some other part of the world?
Right. And I'm not getting any of that in the literature that I'm reading. Okay. I get very little coming out of South America. You probably would have to talk to somebody who knew a little bit more about that. But yes, and that study, by the way, is in its infancy right now.
Okay.
They're still identifying ways to mark genetics through time. Mitochondrial DNA and certain haplotypes seem to persist through lineages, and some don't. So they're still finding these markers, and it's blossoming right now. They're going to start testing people and find out that there may be some European DNA, there may be some Polynesian DNA. We don't know, until you get a large sample together. And when they do that, you're going to find some interesting things, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've established that people for sure came across there. There's some, we don't know exactly where everybody came from.
Right.
But then what did they do? And how did they, because would pretty much every part of North America have had some Native American habitation? I mean, I know in other than places that would have been covered by glaciers, way up north.
These people were obviously explorers, and they were not afraid of what was around the next corner. I don't know if you've ever been on a good fishing stream and you can't wait to see what's around the next corner, but that's the way they were.
Yeah.
And they couldn't wait to see what was around the next corner. What could I eat over there? And they eventually just spread out across North America, filled every corner of it, and then they started populating. The period where the Clovis people were here is called the Paleolithic period. And really, Native American history in the United States can be kind of divided into about 5 different time periods. The Paleo would be Clovis points, Folsom points, a lot of other
So
point
in the
types.
13,500 years period of time, there's 5 sections.
5 sections of sections of development, and they are used to describe how they were living.
Okay.
So this Paleo period, there were bands of people, probably small bands of people, that were chasing megafauna, big animals that don't exist today, and they were hunters. That's what they were doing. They lived on meat. They may have collected some things along the way,
Right.
but they were not planting anything. They were not foraging. They were hunting.
Okay.
And they were hunting things like bison antiquus, which are old bison that were much bigger than the bison that we think of today. Mastodon, mammoth, giant sloth, giant beaver, short-faced bear. I don't know if you've heard of that one or not.
Big bears.
Big stuff.
Yeah,
And these people were probably pretty tough. You didn't want to come across them.
So the Paleo period, well, just for people listening, this is something that I have as just a novice at this. It's something that's marked in my mind that's helped me as I've tried to understand stuff back this big geologic time and stuff, is the Pleistocene period ended 10,000 years ago.
That's about right, yeah.
In the Pleistocene, so 10,000 years ago is when all those big guys died off. It's when the mammoths died. That's when the short-faced bears died. That's when the saber-toothed cats died. That's when the American lion died.
Right.
But there were humans living during that time here.
They were here. And for a long time in American archaeology, they didn't know that. They didn't believe that. But then, Clovis and Folsom sites changed that. They found man-made points mixed in with skeletons from mastodon in Missouri and mammoth in New Mexico. And that was that was big. That was huge to know that men were here with these animals at the same time.
Wow.
That was a big deal. And that was back in the 30s, so we've known that since then. And it's just
Is that when the Clovis site was found?
Yes.
By that guy in New Mexico?
Right.
The 30s. Okay.
Long time ago.
But then there was something else in Missouri?
Yes.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
There's another site up in Missouri, and there's a state park just this side of St. Louis, and I believe it's called the Kimmswick site, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's a pretty neat place.
So I didn't mean to interrupt you, and I'm trying to just piece all this together.
Right.
So this is just like I'm having a private conversation with you, trying to answer my questions. But okay, so there's 13,500 years of occupation, 5 different time periods. The first one was Paleo,
right?
And during that Paleo time period is when humans were hunting mastodons and fighting short-faced bears,
right?
Okay, so start me back from there.
All right. So from there, as the environment changed, the glaciers were retreating, the climate was warming up, and these megafauna were disappearing. Archaeologists call it the economy. The economy changed. What they were doing, and so they had to figure out different ways to survive. And so that's really when the white-tailed deer became a big food source for natives in this area.
And were there white-tailed deer back before the...
Most certainly. And there were elk in Arkansas. There were elk
in the Pleistocene.
Yeah. Yes, they were.
Oh,
yes.
really?
Yes. They
but
probably...
they just were one that survived that whatever happened.
Right.
And so there's a big thing of something happened very rapidly, very quickly, that killed off all these critters.
And the vegetation changed, the landscape changed. And I'd be honest with you, if I had 10 guys with me and we were going to decide whether or not we were going to go try to kill a mastodon or if we were going to hunt down a white-tailed deer, go for the mastodon. And, if you can coordinate a hunt and bring one down, you can feed your whole clan for a long time.
You're going to make a good living.
Right. Deer are not easy to kill. And so when they started having to rely on killing elk and deer and smaller animals, they had to come up with a different way to do that. And so the point type technology really changed about 10,500 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. And they weren't making these fluted points anymore. They were making different types of points that were placed on the end of a stick that was slung at an animal with a tool called an atlatl.
That's when that technology started?
Right.
10,500 years ago?
Somewhere around that time.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you. So all the Clovis points were spears?
Yes, they were probably on long
hand-thrown spears?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and they were having to surround those creatures and bring them down, trap them in a watering hole, something like that. But all those disappeared, and so they had to start, hunting other things to survive. And they also started probably picking some berries. In 2,000 or 3,000 years of experience, there was probably somebody in that tribe of people that knew that the red berries were good and the blueberries were bad.
Yeah.
And so that now they've
Yeah.
got some kind of an idea of what's safe to eat and what's not. So they started foraging more and eating meat when they had it. They probably were eating a lot of mussels out of the freshwater mussels and using a lot more things, eating rabbits and small mammals, things like that. So everything changed. And in this particular region of the country, one of the most spectacular and fantastic point types in North American history evolved, and it's called the Dalton Point. And around here, Dalton Points are highly regarded for their workmanship and for their quality, their size, and they're a very beautiful point type. And that type persisted for maybe 1,000 years, and that point type then evolved into probably several dozen other point types after that. So it's kind of the granddaddy of a lot of them.
Was that the first? Was that the next progression from
Yes,
Clovis?
right.
Clovis to Dalton?
Right. So Clovis.
Describe a Dalton to me.
A Dalton point, some can be over a foot long. Most of them are 2 or 3 inches long. They're generally, the outline is, they call it auriculate, but it's shaped a lot like a Clovis point. And some of them have some fluting, but the fluting on them was created by different means. They weren't hit directly with another rock. They were hit indirectly with something placed in between the point and the striking device. And a lot of Dalton points are not fluted at all. But they're very similar in outline, but you can look at them and see the way they're flaked. The flaking pattern's different. The fluting type is different.
So we're not just talking about, and this is something I learned earlier, is we're not just talking about shapes. You guys are seeing technology
Right.
of the way that they're flaking these points.
You bet. You can look at the flaking pattern on an arrowhead, and you can tell generally what time period it's made from most of the time.
Wow.
Yeah, and the way they made their arrowheads changed through time.
Yeah.
Now the Clovis culture was Paleo, and then the Dalton culture transitioned that Paleolithic lifestyle into a little bit more settled down lifestyle, and so they call this Dalton period the transitional Paleo period.
Okay.
And so they're very old points, but they transitioned these hunters into a hunter-gatherer, type of situation, and that's the archaic, and that's what came after the Dalton points. And these people were relying on anything they could get their hands on. They didn't travel nearly as far, and they were probably,
now by this time there were more people here too.
Right, they were.
They're starting to
and they were starting to form. I wouldn't call them tribes, but clans maybe, or groups of people that were interrelated. They probably met certain times of the year at big rivers and got together and shared technology. They shared stories. They probably married off daughters and sons to other tribes to prevent any inbreeding. They did a lot of things, but they were more settled.
This would be the archaic period,
right?
So that would be the third after the Dalton. That's
Correct.
the period,
right?
So Paleo, Dalton, archaic.
You got it. And the archaic can be further subdivided into early, middle, and late. But for what we're talking about, just lumping it together is going to work.
And that's taken us to like 8,000 years ago.
Yeah, the early archaic probably started around maybe 9,800 years ago, something like that, and lasted till about 5,000, 4,000 years ago.
So it was a big period.
Very long time period.
and it's a time period because of the progression of technology stayed the same. Are the time periods differentiated by a progression of technology?
That and economy. That
just the way they made a living.
The way they made a living.
So everything for that 5,000 year period was fairly stable?
Fairly stable, yeah.
In terms of what kind of animals were here, what kind of technology they had, how they were making a living.
Exactly.
And
that
makes sense.
And as those populations grew and they learned how to do things, life got a little easier for them. And so what happened after that is that people started interconnecting with each other a lot more. Now let's go back to the Dalton culture for just a few minutes. They're the first people in North America that used woodworking tools. As far as we know, they made an adze, a woodworking tool that's fairly diagnostic of their culture, and they were making dugout canoes, and so they were the first people that were probably using waterways that we know of, and they were also the first culture in North America to bury their dead in a location over time. Now, all of these people most likely buried their dead, but these people buried them in the same locations repeatedly. And so the oldest known cemetery in North America is over in Greene County, Arkansas, and it's called the Sloan site. And it was excavated in the 1980s by Dan Morse and some other archaeologists from this area, and it was interpreted as a burial site.
So that would be interpreted from an anthropological position as a fairly developed society.
Yes.
I mean, it's coming from these people that were just like,
right,
just kind of spread out, uncivilized.
Right.
You know, and then this is showing, hey, these people are starting to.
They're getting some structure to their society, some hierarchy.
And that would have been in the
structure.
Dalton time period.
Right, about
and
10,000 years ago.
By this time, there wasn't tribes.
No,
they were just people.
Right. We really, when we think of the word tribe, we tend to think of Quapaw, Catawba, these names that we have. But these people weren't. They didn't have names.
See,
yet.
That's news to me right there, Adam. I mean, I've never even thought of it that deep. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, I hear about these Native American names and tribes, and would have thought that all these points could be brought back to a certain.
Yeah.
This is making a lot of sense to me. So they were just people.
They were just people.
And then as this over 10,000 years, when society got really organized, that's when they started having these more modern tribes.
Right. And they probably didn't have a need for a name for us, because they weren't coming across other people that often, so they didn't have to have a reason to say.
So identity would be forged only when you had other people that you needed to differentiate yourself from.
Right.
Okay.
And so, and also you have to remember they didn't have a written language. And so this stuff was not written down. It's passed down through oral histories. And I know Native Americans, and they talk about the ancient ones, just like the Egyptians refer to their ancient ones. They're probably referring to people that were here a long time before they were, but didn't have a name, just the ancient ones.
Yeah.
Going back to these Daltons, they were a very big group of people, and they did things that hadn't been done before. They started to settle down more. They made very high quality artifacts, mainly projectile points. They weren't into making any kind of artistic expression types of certainly no pottery, no effigies of animals or anything like that. But they were a predecessor of many different types of points that evolved over the Archaic period. And the Archaic period in Arkansas is a very interesting time period. In northern Arkansas, there are a lot of caves, and there were a lot of groups of people that utilized those caves on a regular basis.
And big overhangs. We got these big limestone bluffs with big, beautiful overhangs that made great shelters.
Well, most people who hunt have been through some of these at some point or another and seen the smoke stains on the top of the cave, and that's old. But they were utilizing these for shelter, stay warm, stay dry, and they were still probably in small bands at that point. But that's what the Archaic in Arkansas is all about. It was people moving up and down these rivers and streams, trying to stay close to fresh water, trying to stay warm, trying to stay dry, trying to find some food, and just eke out a living. It was tough.
Yeah,
you just can't. We just can't imagine it.
I don't want to pull you off of because we're going down through the time periods, and it would be good to get kind of an overview of the different time periods. Mm-hmm. So maybe this question is going to throw us off course, but when did they get to Arkansas?
When did they get to Arkansas? We have found Clovis points in Arkansas. They were here 13,500 years ago.
Wow.
And a matter of fact, my house here in Izard County near Melbourne, my house sits on top of a site that we find arrowheads in a lot. And my son Liam has found a Clovis point in our yard, in our field.
Wow.
That's 13,500 years old. So they were here.
Wow.
They were here within, that at least that technology was here. There may have been people here before that, but we know that Clovis was here in Arkansas. They're here.
Are there Clovis on the East Coast?
You bet.
Really?
You bet. Florida, all the way up into New York and even southern Canada, all the way.
See, I would have thought there would have been like a. I mean, if they came from the Bering Strait, it seems like, I don't know. I guess that technology just scattered, and there's no way to really tell what came before that, or
they were following food. You have to remember they were following food. Some of these later archaic and Dalton cultures, they may have been traveling up and down river systems and staying within a kind of a defined area that they called their own. But the Clovis people and these Paleolithic people, they were following food. If the mastodon went over there, they went over there. I mean, they just followed the food.
I wonder how long it would take a guy on foot to travel from Alaska to the east coast of the United States.
It's interesting because that study's been done, and it takes a long time, and that's one of the reasons that this doesn't make sense, is because the dating period for Clovis points is just within a few hundred years, but they estimate it would have taken man a lot longer than that, just hunting and following game to spread out through North America. It doesn't make sense.
I wonder how fast a guy could do it if he just walked. I mean, like 2 years?
It would take me a lot longer than that.
Yeah. I mean, they would have had no reason to just walk in a dead. I mean, they wouldn't have done that. But if you think about it from that perspective, though, like, I mean, maybe they could have in 5 years walked from there to the East Coast. I mean, so I guess when you think about it like that, it's not as big a stretch as you might think.
Yeah, but you got to remember too, there were no roads. There
was
nothing. There was nobody even to tell you which way to go.
Yeah,
you know, so it was more meandering than it was walking a straight line anywhere. But up and down mountains, can you imagine? They didn't know where the mountain passes were. They didn't know, and they had to follow water. And so anytime you had to follow water, you're not walking a straight line. You're following a river, which is rarely a straight line.
And they didn't have any reason to move other than food, or maybe they've been pushed out by something, another group, or so it's not like they were trying to go somewhere.
No,
they were just trying to get to the next place that they could make a living.
Right. Imagine walking out into the Bear Woods with all your stuff and knowing you're never coming back home again, and whatever you had with you, that's what you had to survive with. And then you had to make it. When you ran out of it, you had to make more of it, or you didn't get any more. Arrowheads or points or arrows or whatever. It's beyond our comprehension. We have it so easy
really
these
is.
days. It's tough to think about. I've been out hunting before, and after a few hours, my feet get cold, and I'm done. They couldn't be done.
What do they think the lifespan of these like paleo people would have been? 30 years?
Yeah, that's probably a pretty good estimate. They probably died of trauma or some type of disease that
teeth rotting out.
Right. These people probably looked a lot older than they were.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, think about that, a 30-year-old man being an old man in your culture.
Probably a wise man. He'd seen a lot probably.
After 30 years.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So, what comes after archaic?
Well, the archaic is replaced by a time period called the woodland time period.
Okay.
And the woodland time period, again, can be divided into 2 or 3 more time periods, but we'll stick with just woodland. They were much more settled. They started developing pottery. They learned to use clay. They had
a little more free time, didn't they?
They did. They had
started making some art.
Well, they had figured out where the good spots were. It's like you don't tell somebody where your good arrowhead spot is. They had found where the good places to live were, and they stayed there. And they started learning to gather a lot more, and maybe a little bit of planting of things going on. Maybe it's planting some wild seeds and starting to know how to do this, developing that kind of knowledge. But that allowed the Native Americans in North America a lot more free time, and that's an important thing because when that happens, cultures start creating things of beauty, things that reflect their identity. Who they are, and that's important because the Hopewell tradition that kind of sprouted out in Indiana and Ohio and Illinois and Tennessee and Kentucky had its roots spread out all across the United States. They're bringing in obsidian from the western United States that can be found in mounds in Ohio.
And so the Hopewell tradition was basically this idea that these tribes were coming together to trade and to do stuff. Bet.
It probably wasn't,
that's what that means.
Probably wasn't one group of people, but it was lots of groups of people that were interconnected by networks and trading and understanding.
Yeah.
And so they're bringing in mica from Georgia, they're bringing in conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and Pitkin chert from north central Arkansas. They're bringing in the finest materials from everywhere, and they're trading things now. And so things are more stable. They've got a lot more access to better food, more calories. better shelter. They're learning how to do things, and from that really erupted an artistic movement from Native Americans. That's wow.
What were they making?
They would make clay pipes. Were starting to use copper to make plates and ornamental objects. A lot of what we call effigies. An effigy is a representation of usually an animal or a person, but they would turn those into pipes and decorative objects and pendants and all kinds of things. And so we have a lot of that knowledge
in the woodland period. When would the woodland time period have been?
It probably would start around 3,500 years ago and maybe go to about 2,500, 2,000 years ago.
That was just like yesterday.
Yeah, it was not. It's still very old, but it's much younger than these people that were chasing the mastodon. And then after this woodland period, the cities of North America started to develop, and you have to think about Poverty Point down in Louisiana, mounds that were made over just east of Little Rock, Toltec mounds, and the mounds up in southern Illinois, the Cahokia mounds. This really transitioned into the Mississippian period, it's called. People were living on much larger rivers.
Is that the final period?
This is the final period before contact, the last pre-contact period.
Let me try this. Paleo, Dalton, Archaic, Woodland, Mississippian.
You got it.
Man, I've heard those words my whole life, and it's real confusing unless you just sit down and just do what we're doing here.
Exactly, and it's taken me 15 years of a lot of time to learn all this stuff, and to acquire a collection of points from all these different time periods, so you can really visually see it.
Well, it makes sense.
Unfold in front of you.
So the woodland, would that have been the time period when the tribes began to
probably build
some identity and have names?
Right. Okay. I would say so. Okay. They probably had identities at that point, and they were interconnected, and they were using waterways to travel much easier with large amounts of goods, things like that. And from that's when these big cities, erupted, and that probably had a lot to do with the introduction of maize from Central America. Now, corn's got calories. We all know that now, and so we try to stay away from too much of it. But back then, that was a big deal. Calories are a big deal. And so when they started getting these extra calories, they didn't have to try so hard for food anymore. They could plant it and harvest it. And so they started building these mounds, one bucket of dirt at a time, and they built these huge cities. One of the things we don't know is, why did these cities fall apart? What the social structure fell apart, and by the time Europeans got here, a lot of these cities had been abandoned for a long time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So they were gone a long time.
Right.
Did they build the mounds to keep out of the floods?
Probably not. They probably had a hierarchical structure to their society.
Oh, it was just like having a big mansion on the hill.
You bet. And the guy that was running everything, or the girl, I guess, was living on top of that. Yeah, it was. You bet.
So when Europeans got here, they found remnants of these cities, just like we would today.
Right. You bet.
Wow.
Yeah, for the most part. There are a lot of accounts of DeSoto coming across tribes in eastern Arkansas that are felt to be Quapaw or Nodina, maybe tribes, but they were a little bit scattered by then. They weren't living in these huge cities.
So there was a stronger population of people pre-European settlement.
Yes.
I mean, yes. I guess the idea, what I would think is that the Native American cultures were at their peak, and then Europeans showed up and broke it all up. Right. But that's not necessarily true?
That's not necessarily true at all. In my mind, my personal way of thinking about this is that by the time Europeans got here, Native Americans were almost in this post-apocalyptic stage. Something happened. And they really don't know what happened in a lot of these large cities and places that existed. They really don't know if it had to do with disease or warfare or a drought.
Was that across the country? I know you're talking about these Arkansas sites in the Delta of Arkansas.
You bet. And you get out into Mesa Verde and see the Anasazi. There are entire cities that were carved into the walls of rocks, and these people just up and disappeared. Just in a very short period of time. And really nobody knows why, to a lot of these. But I think they're trying to get enough information together where they can kind of put the puzzle together now. So
that's eye-opening to me. I didn't realize that. So
now we don't get me wrong, we did some damage too. I'm not trying to
no
downplay
doubt.
that.
Understood.
But it was the last nail in the coffin, I think.
Yeah.
And
well, hey, that really helps me. That breaks down all these periods in a pretty simple way. I want to go back to the stone projectile point. So there's lots of different things that you could find out here, these axe heads or grinding stones. I mean, they used stone a lot, but they used a projectile stone point. Okay, we said that in the Clovis period, they were just hand-thrown spears.
Right.
Then when we got into the Archaic period, they started using the atlatl,
right.
which, if you don't know what atlatl is, go look it up. Well, it's just it helps you throw a spear like twice as fast.
Right.
As you can throw it.
ATL. Just Google that, and you'll get a visual of it.
When did they get bow and arrows?
Bow and arrows were very late development. Probably not until the woodland, at least, and maybe even
really?
Mississippi. And
So for 5,000 years, they were using an atlatl.
You bet.
Did the bow cancel out the atlatl?
No. When Europeans got here, there were still groups of people in this country that were using those. It was the bow and arrow had not completely replaced it at all.
Okay. But the atlatl would have been better for killing big stuff, though.
Probably so.
Just because you're chunking a much bigger. You're chunking a spear.
Right.
Super fast.
It's kind of like using a 30-06 for an elk, and using a 270 for a whitetail deer. I mean, you pick your weapon for what you're know your quarry and know what's going to bring it down.
Where did the archery technology come from?
That's a good question.
Did it start up everywhere, all over the planet at the same time?
It did develop all over the world and within a relatively short time span.
Now is that now you said convergent? You talked about
that's convergent evolution.
Was that technology would have had to have been connected?
You'd think it would.
But it started happening here at the same time that it started happening. Where else did they have bows?
Oh, they have bows and arrows in Africa, the Aborigines in Australia, over in Asia. All of these different Aboriginals were using this technology at about the same time period. Nobody really knows how that happened. I mean,
that's crazy because there was no email, there was no internet. It would have had to have been human to human. If the technology was shared, it would have had to have been human-to-human contact.
Maybe aliens. I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe
and
aliens.
So that means that somebody would have had to have gotten from North America to Europe. That really is such a mystery. Or maybe just in the progression. Like if you think of this as like a board game, and the board game is that you're this human that's dropped onto this planet, and you got to make a living, and you start napping stones together. Maybe there's some connection and progression.
There is.
Of just what you would do.
You bet.
I mean, is that? Do people say that?
Yes, and that makes sense.
So in theory, you could they could discover the same technology at the same time as here, disconnected just because of the way they were living their life.
Right.
Oh, okay.
If two different cultures on the other side of the world, developed a wheel at the same point, at some point they're going to decide they're going to hook two of them together, so they both invented an axle. It's the same type of thing. I think it is a natural progression, and it's also necessity is the mother of invention. As the game got smaller and we pretty much eradicated a lot of the larger species here, there was a need to shoot smaller quarries also.
Right. Which a bow would have been good for.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of people call the types of arrows that Mississippian period people used bird points. And there are a lot of things going around, people saying that they use them to shoot birds. Well, that's not true. They just I don't know why they call them that, but they do. We call them arrow points because it was a true arrow point. They were shot on a bow and arrow.
Now this would be a question I would have. I have found small points that are like an inch long, an inch wide, let's just say an inch by an inch. Certainly that would have been connected to an arrow shaft.
Possibly, but that's also large enough to be connected to a half-inch wide shaft on a rattle dart also.
Okay.
So, only the smallest ones were probably used as true arrow points, but there's no way to know for sure, There are historical documentation of some of the types of arrow points that we know of today that were being used on arrows when people got here, and so we know some of those point types were definitely being used on arrows.
Yeah. Okay, so we're talking about stone projectile points. You said that there was a reason that they would have like this fluted Dalton point.
You bet.
And if you're in front of a computer and listen to this, just type in Dalton point and you can understand. We could describe it, but it's almost too hard to describe verbally to get a good picture. But what I want to step into now is the different types of points and get to this Calf Creek point.
You bet.
Okay, but
Yeah.
start with the Clovis. Start with
All
the
right.
Clovis and why. So it's a real specific technology, but why? And our people understand that because we're bow hunters.
You bet.
And I mean, we talk about
Well,
broadheads all the time and different types of
Right.
animals we'd shoot
Well,
with them.
I've been bow hunting for about 20 years, 25 years now, and I've seen the technology in broadheads change dramatically in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
You know, with use, you understand what works and what doesn't, and what may be better.
Right,
And
right.
there's a lot of different people out there experimenting to see what works better now. But they were doing the same thing. You know, they got back from a hunt, sat down, and said, "Hey, what went wrong?"
Yeah.
And so somebody figured out a way to do something a little bit different. And these Clovis people, they were fluting their points. They were basically thinning the point at the base of the arrowhead.
The part that would touch
projectile point,
that,
right,
that would touch the shaft.
where it was hafted onto the shaft.
Okay.
You know, the hafting element. And most people believe that was to thin it out, to make it where it would, you know, kind of lower the profile of the area of that shaft directly attached to the arrowhead. That's
For better penetration?
Right, probably so. Yes.
So that because they would have taken a stick and split it, shoved this stone point down in there.
Yes.
And so if the arrowhead at the base of it was super thick, then it would make that wood
right.
fold out even further.
Right.
If it was thinner.
You bet.
And so it was a issue of penetration then.
And that's what most people believe and have believed for a long
Okay.
time. And I've read
That's
I've read a study that was done here fairly recently that showed that the thinning, they believe that the thinning, the fluting was done because it lessened the likelihood that the point would break when it did penetrate an animal. There's some type of a shock absorbing property to thinning that point like that. You know, that's still debatable.
How would they have
also.
known that?
Exactly. That's my point. Those people weren't thinking, how can I make this? How can I design this? They didn't have a wind tunnel or any way of testing this
Yeah.
theory. I don't believe that. I really don't. I think they were trying to thin it down.
Maybe it's true, but that's not why they did it.
Right. Maybe that happened. Maybe that it did decrease the breakage percentage, whatever. But I don't think that's why they were doing it. No.
Yeah. Okay.
So they progressed into Dalton points. Things changed a little bit. Dalton points transitioned into probably 20 or 25 different point
Now,
types.
did they necessarily get better over time?
Well, it depends on how you define better. Better means more. If better is more suited for your environment, yes, by definition, because Dalton points were not what was needed during the woodland period, and so the points that were made during the woodland met their needs better than Dalton points would have. So you can only surmise that the best point that existed was the one that existed.
I guess the technology never went backwards.
No, and it never really did. No,
Okay.
Everything changed. So you get into the archaic period, and you've got this early, middle, and late archaic, and you wanted to talk about Calf Creek points a little bit. They are
Describe it to us.
They're beautiful. They're very wide and can be long, but they're generally fairly short, and they have notching, deep notching that can be sometimes a half an inch or an inch deep that goes into the base of the arrowhead. They're
Right.
hard to describe. But they're very unique, and there are similar point types called Andis and Bell points that are found more down into Texas, but it's generally believed they're the same arrowhead. They're the same projectile point, but they're gorgeous points. They're unique. There's nothing like them anywhere else in North America,
And they're from right here.
they are. They start up
Central. Are we in the?
Yeah.
We're kind of in the east central Ozarks.
Yeah, I would say, and these points can be found up into central Missouri, down into north central and central Arkansas, over into northern Texas, northern Louisiana, over and encompasses much of Kansas and Oklahoma also. These people we know were hunting bison. They were hunting bison with these. And for a long time, it was believed that this was a knife type. It was not a projectile point. And that's been disproven. And if you have internet access, you need to look this up. There was a Calf Creek point that was found embedded in a bison's skull. And studies were done on it, and it was authenticated. There's always a question when you find something like that, did somebody shove that in there?
Right,
But it's been well studied, and it's been proven to be the real deal. So they were chunking these things at bison. And
Atlatls?
you bet.
Or spears?
Yes, probably most likely atlatls.
When were these? What time period would the Calf Creek have been?
Middle and late Archaic is where.
So they would have been using atlatls at that point.
You bet.
And so this Calf Creek technology is like way different.
It is. It's totally
now,
different.
Now it would have. I think in modern terms, Adam, we would have called this almost like a barbed broadhead.
Yeah.
A barbed broadhead, by definition, means that the blade of the point extends below the point where the arrow touches the broadhead.
Right.
I mean, there's regulations about it. You, like in Alaska and Idaho, you can't use the barbed broadhead.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because it's like where it goes down. So like on these Calf Creek points, the haft, it seems like would the blades have extended below where the haft went up?
They most definitely would have, sometimes even an inch.
Oh, this is totally a barbed broadhead.
Yeah, it's a barbed broadhead.
You couldn't use these in Alaska.
Well, they what that did is it increased the cutting edge on it, and if they could shove that thing into there, lethality is not necessarily always about penetration. A lot of times it has to do with how much stuff can you cut.
So these are wide.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've shot deer with a bow that didn't run nearly as far as a deer that I've shot with a 30-06, that went out the outside of because you shoot an arrow in there and it's cutting stuff. That thing bleeds out real quick.
Yeah.
A lot of times, and it drops real quick if you can hit the aorta or something like that. And so they were onto something. They were.
Now, these aren't real sharp points.
No.
Well, when I say sharp, I mean like some of these, like the Clovis points are like these long kind of like.
They don't have an acute angle on the tip of it, I think is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, it's kind of more rounded
More
almost.
rounded, yeah. And by the location where this, Calf Creek point was found in this bison skull, it looks like it was they were trying to shoot it in the back of the neck or maybe up in the neck area. I think they were onto something, is my opinion. I think they were trying to cut its,
Okay, they were like, this is where you want to hit one with one of these things.
Well,
they would have been just like us, like saying, this is where you shoot a deer. This is where you shoot a bear.
Why would you want to shoot a bison through the thickest part of the body, where it's got a big hump full of fat, when you've got an exposed neck veins, jugular veins, carotid arteries, things like that, So that's my opinion.
Yeah.
For what it's worth.
So, and just to say it, there would have totally been bison here.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, even in the 1800s, there were bison in Arkansas.
You bet.
And elk and wolves and mountain lions and tons of crazy stuff.
And I've read some really unbelievable numbers on how many bison at one time roamed the United States. It was in the tens of millions. I mean, maybe as many as 80 or 90 or 100 million bison in North America. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of debunks that greenhouse gas thing, too, from cows, too, because there were lots of bison.
There were a lot of bison
here. Yeah.
Putting out some greenhouse gas.
You bet.
So the Calf Creek, though, now why is Calf Creek, if there's Calf Creek other places, why do we know that it started here? Or is this like the epicenter of?
It really is. The first place that these were described or found and described was in a cave up in Searcy County, Arkansas, called Calf Creek Cave.
Okay.
It's also called Snowball Cave. It actually has another name too, I've heard too. But Don Dickinson, an archaeologist, did a lot of excavation up in Calf Creek Cave and found these there. And so he named the point type after Calf Creek. But this and then
area, they found the technology in other places.
They did, yeah.
Okay, I see.
And so this area, really, if you were going to put a pin in the middle of the distribution, it would probably be somewhere around Fayetteville, Arkansas, I would say.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So I could find one of those in my front yard?
You sure could. Yeah,
really?
You can. And we found a piece of one here at the Grayside in Izard County. Yeah. Yeah, so they're here, and they hunted primarily bison. That's what they were doing. They were still, that was their economy, was bison hunting,
Wow. And that would have been in the Archaic period.
Right. Probably middle and late Archaic, yeah.
Man, that clarifies a lot. That is also
and for
perfect.
Anybody that out there that's listening, you ought to look up a Calf Creek projectile point just to get a visual what that looks like. They're just absolutely
point.
They're
You've
gorgeous.
Got 5 or 6 here in your collection, or maybe more than that.
Yeah, and they're one of my favorites. They're anybody that's got a nice Calf Creek, and they're actually one of the more valuable point types because they're so rare. Those ears that stick down so far, they break.
Wow.
They're most often found broken. By far. If you have an intact Calf Creek point, you have a nice point.
Yeah, that's something.
Yeah.
Man, that answers a whole lot of questions that I had. Okay. Is there – well, let me transition into another section. What about people finding points? How do you find stone points?
There are a lot of different ways to do that. I think a lot of people just walk creeks. For some reason, the sites that contain these points were on water, they were on creeks, and floods come through and they erode out a bank and they wash into the creek, and you find them.
They just become a part of the creek system.
Right.
They're just in gravel bars.
They're just rolling along the creek.
Would you say, this is a thought that I've had, I've found a few points in creeks, is that you find, like, gravel distributes based upon size in creeks. Just based upon water flow. Like, there's areas of a gravel bar where there's the big rocks, small rocks, fine rocks. So you look in the areas where there's the size rocks that would be the size of a projectile point. Is that right?
Exactly right.
Because that creek starts to filter out stuff based upon size.
It sure does. It's just like panning for gold. You start filtering out bigger stuff and then smaller and smaller, and eventually you work it down to you've got a layer of stuff in there that's got the gold dust in it. Same thing with arrowheads. Once you figure out where you're looking, I've got a little nook down here in my creek that I've been wanting to look at. It makes a hard, sharp right-hand turn at the bottom of it. It's a lot deeper there than it is just upstream. And all these rocks are layering down in the bottom of this as they fall out of the current. And so we're going to get down there one of these days with a shovel and just take shovels full of that and
run it through a filter.
Yeah, run it through the screen. And see what we find. It's trial and error. It's neat.
So walking creeks.
That's one way to do it.
Okay, what else?
Walking fields that have been plowed for agriculture is another way to do it too.
That's probably the biggest way that people find stuff.
It has been for the last 150 years, but that's changing a lot because they've gone to a lot of no-till technology now, especially up in the Midwestern states. They're trying to conserve that layer of good dirt, and so they're drilling stuff in now.
Right. Yeah.
Lot less of it now, but this is how a lot of this stuff got found. Old collection points that they would plow a field with mules. And I've heard stories here in my yard where we find these points that they were actually plowing this field with mules, and they would pick up these arrowheads, and sometimes they were pretty good size and very sharp. They would put them in buckets and go dump them out somewhere to keep the mules from cutting their feet.
Oh, wow.
And they didn't even regard these things as being anything culturally important or valuable or anything. They were a pain in their rear.
Wow. It's like finding a knife blade out in your yard and you throw it to the edge so cut something.
Get out of the way.
That's incredible.
Yeah. I can't imagine that, But
here's a question about plowing. How deep are these? Because I've heard a friend of mine, a friend of ours over here, Paul Lee. They do some digging on private land. You can't dig on public land.
Not at all. You gotta have. That's a big no-no.
Big no-no. So that's. Yeah. But if you have private land and you have permission, it's your land, you can dig some of these limestone bluffs and stuff. And they're finding points like way deep in the ground.
You bet.
That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, it depends. Older stuff is deeper. That's a general rule of thumb in archaeology.
Sediment is just built up.
And it kind of depends on how fast the sediment's building up. If you've got a creek that ever gets under the floodplain, of a creek, and this overhang's getting flooded and silt and sand's washing in there.
It could be stuff buried under there.
Right. It could be 10, 15 feet deep. But it may just be inches. You just don't know. And so if you're looking for places to hunt, you go into a cave. They say, and I've never dug a cave. I haven't had that experience yet. But you go back to the back of the cave and dig straight down, and you define how deep the artifacts are. Just dig it straight down. So, but I haven't had the chance to do that yet.
Well, and
Paul Lee, you haven't invited me yet.
Yeah, hopefully he'll hear this.
Yeah.
Because my question was about, like, in your plowed field. Like, are you? I mean, there's a point where there just isn't anything below that point.
It stops. Yeah.
Where is that? Different for everywhere, I guess.
It is, and it's different even in this field here. Some places we have found stuff down it's probably 2 feet deep. In some places it's very shallow before you hit that clay layer that doesn't have anything in it. Kind of depends on the topography and what's eroded off, what's washed off, and what hasn't. So it could be on the surface. It could be 2-3 feet deep. Just depends,
Because these people have been here for 15,000 years, 13,000 years.
Long
so
time.
Just sediment changes, soil builds.
You bet.
Soil.
And, one of the interesting things about this field here that I have at my house where we find points, Izard County is not exactly well known for its high quality soil.
Yeah. Nowhere in the Ozarks is.
We've got a few rocks here, but this particular field has actually got really good soil. And in my opinion is that it probably is an accumulated biolayer of occupation over a long period of time. These people were eating, and they had refuse and things like that, and it just builds up a good organic layer of dirt in it.
Yeah.
It's just kind of strange.
Walking creeks, plowing fields. We just talked about digging in overhangs, which is something that is common in the Ozarks.
It is.
Only on private land where you have permission. They'll throw you in jail if you do it in public land.
You bet. That's a big deal.
So what other ways do you find airheads?
Flea markets.
Okay. Let somebody else find them and go
exactly
buy them
right.
from them.
No, yeah. Everybody in this county knows that I'm an airhead collector, so I have a lot of people come to me and want me to look at their stuff, and so sometimes you find them without having to set foot out of your house.
Yeah.
But going back to finding them, other ways you can find them. Liam, you have any other ideas how you find them?
What about like location? Because I'm actually formulating an article that I'm going to write about how to find stone projectile points. So I'm usurping resource from you to write my article. What about you told me that this, like where you live,
right?
Describe to me why this is a good site. Because right here, just a random piece of property you bought, quote unquote random, you built your house here, and you found, hundreds of stone projectile points and flakes. And what makes this good? Like if somebody were to go out and find something like this on their own.
My dad always told me good property is good property. And if it's good property now, it was good property 10,000 years ago.
I've never thought of that. That makes sense.
It's got water on it. And, you've got some springs. You've got water. Water holds game. Water makes things grow. And
it's flat.
Right. Yeah. And so, you're looking for places that have springs coming out of nowhere, good cold water that's running water. Those people knew that drinking stagnant water was probably not very good for you.
Yeah. And if they didn't, they learned quick when they died.
They sure did. And so they stayed pretty close to water. And they lived close to water, and where they lived is where they dropped things. And so that's probably the number one. Now, the paleo people were maybe a little bit different. If you're looking for Clovis points or things like that, you're probably going to be looking for an area where they may have been trying to catch mammoth or mastodon crossing a creek. In a really hilly area like this, there tend to be lower areas where animals still to this day cross the creek more frequently than they do. They're not going to go from one bluff over to the other bluff. They're going to go look for a low spot.
I see.
And that's where they'd ambush these things where they can't get away. They get them down in a low area like that, and in water, 5 feet of water is going to make a mastodon a heck of a lot less tenacious than if he's up on his, get him where he's weak. So that's where they find a lot of these is lower areas, creek crossings, and that's the paleo. But after that, you're looking for springs. You're looking for water. More than anything.
This is just the way that I've found heads is you've got to have bare dirt. Mm-hmm. You're not going to find an arrowhead underneath a layer of thick leaves out in the woods.
No, you're not.
You're not going to find an arrowhead under a layer of thick grass. Mm-hmm. And so, like, the places I deer hunt, the places I coon hunt. Last night I went coon hunting. I was looking for arrowheads the whole time on cattle trails, and then and just wherever there's bare dirt, you have the potential to find an arrowhead. And as the soil washes away in these places where there's exposed dirt because of livestock or because of whatever, it could be where the first arrowhead I found on my property actually wasn't because of my mules. It was because I was pushing some brush with my tractor and skinned up the ground.
Right.
And like 3 weeks later, after it rained and it washed the surface of that dirt off, I found a head. So basically, just anywhere there's an exposed bank, creek bank, I've heard of people finding them on cut banks of a creek, like the outside bend of a creek where it's continually cutting.
That happens a lot. You'll come across a cut bank like that, and you'll see some flint or maybe even some mussel shells, like discarded mussel shells or something like that showed a habitation area. Yeah. And then it's on. That's where it is.
Well, and that's another good point, and I'm formulating my article as we speak, where – like on my property, I find that we could go out there right now, and I guarantee you we could find flint flakes. I mean, every time I walk out there, find flint flakes. And there's no flint in the area that I'm at. I mean, like in Northwest Arkansas, right where I'm at, we've got sandstone and limestone. And I mean, that is right for what I know of the area, that's all we have. They were getting their chert and flint and stone materials from somewhere else. Right. Maybe not very far away. There's some places not very far away where they're getting it. Yeah. But so when I see like pink rocks and white rocks and pick it up and it's that smooth, flinty chert. You bet. I mean, that is the evidence of percussion napping. Am I right?
You're right. You're absolutely right.
Where if you can find flint flakes, then you know that you're in the ballpark. And I learned this just because I watched a guy nap some arrowheads, is that there's a tremendous amount of refuse.
There is.
I mean, so if you have one arrowhead, to make one arrowhead, you would have
100 flakes or more.
See, I think that's something that I wouldn't have known unless I'd seen somebody do it.
Right.
So these little flakes that you find indicate that Native Americans were here, they were working on stone tools, and so there's surely intact stone tools somewhere.
Right. So, they're there.
Yeah.
And, this flint in chert that you're talking about, you're right. The Ozark Mountains just don't have certain types of rocks that they have in southern Arkansas or out at Yellowstone Park. We have sedimentary rock here. It's sandstone. It's limestone. It's not adequate for really any kind of tool
flint
making.
would be a metamorphic rock formed by
would
heat.
Be. That's exactly right.
I don't know if it is.
It's a sedimentary rock, and it just gets compressed over time, and certain nodules of that would form within these layers of limestone and sandstone in the bluffs.
Okay.
And so the white...
Now, metamorphic?
Probably so, yes.
Okay. Compressed by heat?
You bet.
Okay.
Compressed
just
by
clarify.
heat and just sheer weight of limestone.
Okay.
But these, in the White River, the river's been cutting through these limestone bluffs for so long, it exposes a lot of these nodules. They fall out, the nodules fall out and roll around in the river for a long time. They get a river, it's a cortex it's called, a brownish color on the outside of the rock. But if you take that rock and you break it open, you don't know what you're going to find. It may be black pick and chert, the most beautiful colored chert you've ever seen. It may be some blue and white mottled looking Pinner's chert, and some of these are really good at making bifaces with because they retain a really sharp edge.
Tell me what a biface is. You've used it before.
Yeah, a biface is kind of a generic term for any arrowhead, projectile point,
double-sided,
two sides. Yes, generally both sides of it are napped, and so they're working on one side and turning it over, making it two-faced.
Biface.
Biface reduction technology, and that's what you make arrowheads with. And they had to find that kind of rock, and when they find a good source of it, they would go back to that source over and over and over again. And there are known quarry sites in this area and all over the country.
And they would have. This was news to me just since in the last few years, but they wouldn't. So if they were trading and getting this stuff from other places, they wouldn't carry a 25-pound stone back 50 miles to wherever they were going to nap it. But they would make what do you call it? What they would do?
They would make what they would do is they'd take that rock and they'd knock pieces out of it, and they probably would knock it down into a manageable, maybe hand-sized piece of flint or chert that they could put in a bag of some type and carry it with them. They would call that a quarry blank. A blank that they had quarried out of somewhere, and then so
people find those a lot. I've got a nice blank, or I feel like it's probably a blank.
Yeah,
it's about that big, about as big around as a baseball.
Yeah,
about half an inch thick, fairly developed, but still pretty rough.
Right.
So it was probably a blank that somebody just lost.
Yep. And a lot of times they would take those blanks and they would try to work it down into a nice point of some type, and there may have been what they call a stack on there. There may have been a piece of rock inside that they just couldn't get it knocked off there right, and they finally just got mad and threw it down and said, I'm going to move along to a different piece. So we find a lot of quarry blanks out here in my field too, and sometimes you don't know why they lost it. Sometimes you can tell they were having a hard time working that particular piece.
Got rid of it.
Just got done with it, I'm done with that.
That's an interesting thing to think about is why how all these points got here. But yeah, some would have been broken while they were working on them. Some would have been broken when they shot at something. Some were full pieces that just got lost. Some were, I don't know. I guess
some were most assuredly buried with people.
Buried with, you said they used to do that.
You bet. They did.
Well, man, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for letting me come out. I mean, I just met you today.
Yeah.
We spoke on the phone this last week. We had to come over here to buy a squirrel dog, which is high priority stuff for us.
Yeah.
We had to come over in this part of the world, and man, I'm so glad we connected. You did exactly what I wanted to do. I mean, if no one listens to this but me, I'll be happy. But they will. This is really interesting stuff, and I think somebody could listen to this and have a really good picture. I know I have a much better picture of what was happening in the time periods and the different, even the dispersal of humans, the dispersal of technology. So anyway.
Well,
thank you.
I'm glad you came out, and it's always exciting to me to see anybody that's interested in this. And when you're passionate about something and you really like something, you can't wait to talk about it with somebody. Yeah. So I'm glad you came up today, and maybe you can get your boys into this too. And on a personal note with this hunting that we do has really brought my family together. It's getting my kids off their phones. It's getting them outside. We're seeing nature. We're walking. We're talking. We're interacting with each other. We're talking to each other. Yeah. This is a good thing. It's a good, clean fun if you're doing it the right way. Yeah. And really, you're learning a lot. It's a good thing.
Yes, it really is. I mean, my boys have been super intrigued by finding these points in our front yard.
Yeah.
I mean, it just unlocks this. It's just this mystery, of these humans that lived here before us, that were hunting critters on our land and camping and. Well, it makes you really think, is it our land at all? Yeah. It's their land, maybe. Yeah. We're just on it now.
Just temporarily staying on it right now. And, I'm glad to have you out, and I hope to have you back out here sometime, too. If you want to come back, we'll find some arrowheads together. How's that sound?
That sounds awesome. And, hey, you just got me started. I mean, we may do a follow-up podcast one of these days with some more questions.
Hopefully you can get some stills today, too, and maybe show some people some.
Yes, I will. We'll put some stills on our website. So on our website, we'll have the podcast posted, and I will put some still photos of some of these points here in your library on there for sure.
Good deal.
But hey, so this is the Bear Hunting Magazine podcast. So we have a closing thing that I always say. So, and it's keep the wild places wild, because that's where the bears live.
You bet.
And that's where the Native Americans lived and shot bears with stone projectile points.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the engineer's going to be there. Meat Eater Live, headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay, every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Art Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24th, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.